What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about the pronouns they, them, theirs, some issues that have arisen around their use in recent years, and how we can all do a better job of using them responsibly. A while back, I made a video about using the terms AMAB, assigned male at birth, and AFAB, assigned female at birth, responsibly, because there's been a growing tendency for people to talk about assigned gender at birth in ways that don't really make sense, or to turn AMAB and AFAB into another gender binary that's used to misgender people with extra steps. And I've started to notice a similar thing happening with the use of they-them pronouns, so that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this video. Let's start with some contextual information. What exactly are they-them pronouns? In English, we have a few different sets of third-person pronouns that are used to talk about other people, as opposed to second-person pronouns which we use to talk to other people, and first-person pronouns which we use to talk about ourselves. First-person pronouns include I, me, my. Second-person pronouns include you, your, yours, and third-person pronouns are where it gets interesting because that's where gender connotations come into play. These pronouns include he, him, his, which have a masculine connotation, she, her, hers, which have a feminine connotation, and they, them, theirs, which don't have a gender connotation, they're gender neutral. There are other third-person pronouns too, like it, its, or neopronouns. Put a pin in that because we'll come back to it later, but for now, I want to focus on these three pronoun sets. They-them pronouns differ from he, him, and she, her pronouns in a couple of ways. First is that he, him, and she, her are generally used for living beings, like people or pets, but they-them can be used either for living beings or for objects. For example, if someone asks what time your friends are arriving, you might say, they'll be here at 3. And if one of those friends brings you a plate of cookies, you might say, thanks, I'll go put them on the table. Second is that he, him, and she, her are singular, but they, them can be plural or singular. In a plural context, which is the one you'll hear most often, they, them pronouns refer to more than one object or more than one person. For example, if a group of friends go to a movie together, you might say, they went to the movie. In a singular context, they-them pronouns refer to one person in a gender-neutral way. For example, Jess went to the movie and they had a great time. Some people will try to argue that they-them pronouns are plural only and that using them in a singular context is grammatically incorrect. But Merriam-Webster enshrined singular they in the dictionary in 2019, and singular they has been around much longer than that. Centuries longer, actually. The first use of singular they in written English dates all the way back to 1375, which means it's likely been in spoken English even longer. Singular they even predates the use of singular you, which was a plural second-person pronoun with thee, thou as the singular equivalent, until the 15th century, when English speakers began using you as both singular and plural, then dropped the use of thee, thou entirely in the 17th century. So now that we have that little grammar and history lesson about they-them pronouns out of the way, let's take a look specifically at singular they and the way its use has evolved over time. Until recently, singular they has mostly been used to talk about an unknown or a hypothetical person whose gender you can't possibly determine. For an unknown person, an example would be if you found a keychain on the ground, you might say, oh no, someone dropped their keys. For a hypothetical person, an example would be a healthcare pamphlet or flyer that says something like, each patient should take preventative measures based on their individual risk profile. We've also seen singular they used to conceal someone's identity, including gender, typically for anonymity or privacy reasons. That might look something like a crime report saying that the victim of the attack has vacated their home for their own safety. In the early 21st century, another use case for singular they began to take hold and become increasingly widespread, which is people adopting they-them as personal pronouns so that others can refer to them in a gender-neutral way. The drivers of this change have mostly been non-binary people using they-them as an alternative to he, him, or she, her. It's worth noting here that while many non-binary people use they/them pronouns, not all of us do. Some of us use he, him, or she, her pronouns. Some of us use it, its pronouns, which aren't typically used for people. Some of us use neopronouns like z, here, am, fey, fair, etc. See, I told you I would come back to those other third-person pronouns later. And some of us use multiple sets of pronouns, which may or may not include they/them. Also, not all people who use they/them pronouns are non-binary. There are some binary men and women who use they/them pronouns for whatever reason, sometimes alongside gendered pronouns, for example, he, they, or she, they, or alongside other pronouns, or even exclusively. Pronouns do not equal gender is the point I'm trying to make here. They can be a very powerful tool for expressing and affirming gender, but they don't always correlate with gender in the way you might expect. And pronouns aren't exclusively tied to gender. No one gender can lay claim to a particular set of pronouns. Now put a pin in that because it'll be relevant later. The growing use of they/them pronouns for gender affirmation represents a pretty major shift in language for English speakers. After all, we've been using singular they for unknown people or hypothetical people or anonymous people for centuries, but we've only been using singular they to affirm specific people's genders for a few decades. So naturally, most of us are still adjusting to the change. For some, that adjustment looks like the kind of stumbling you might expect from a shift in language this big that happens this fast. For others, that adjustment looks more like resistance to change that's rooted in transphobic bias. Either way, that adjustment is manifesting in some patterns of misuse of they/them pronouns, and that's why I wanted to make this video. So let's get into that now, with 5 ways people approach the use of they/them pronouns incorrectly. Number 1. Thinking of they/them pronouns as non-binary pronouns. Since the recent rise in people using they/them as personal pronouns, there's been a subsequent rise in people thinking that they/them are non-binary pronouns rather than simply gender-neutral pronouns. And the reason that's not good is because of what I said to put a pin in earlier about how pronouns do not equal gender. When we think of they/them pronouns as pronouns for non-binary people, that puts limitations on those pronouns that don't need to exist. Someone who isn't non-binary might think, oh, I can't use they/them pronouns because they're not for me, when in fact they're for anyone who wants to use them. It also helps fuel the misconception that all non-binary people use they/them pronouns, which, as I explained previously, is not the case. I can't tell you how many times I've been called they, even though I make it very clear I'm a he, because people know I'm non-binary and think that they/them are the pronouns all non-binary people use. Number 2. Suddenly forgetting how grammar works when you meet someone who uses they/them pronouns. Most people will call an unknown or hypothetical person they without even thinking about it. But as soon as they meet an actual person who says, please call me they, it's like all that knowledge of how to use they/them pronouns flies right out the window. I've heard countless anecdotes about people saying nonsensical things like, this is Alex and she uses they/them pronouns, or asking, am I supposed to say they is or they are when I talk about you? Even though it works the exact same way as it does when you're talking about an unknown person and you wouldn't even second guess it. Using they/them pronouns for a specific person is a different practice than using they/them pronouns for an unknown person, but the mechanics are still the same. So when people bungle it that badly, it's hard not to think, I wonder why that's happening and whether it could possibly be rooted in some degree of transphobia. Number 3. Using or refusing to use they/them pronouns depending on the situation. This one is definitely rooted in transphobia, and it tends to follow a very specific pattern, which is that when someone asks for they/them pronouns, people refuse to use that and instead go with he, him, or she, her, depending on what they think that person looks like. But also, if, let's say, a woman asks for she, her pronouns and people don't think she looks womanly enough, they'll call her they instead of she, and same thing when a man who doesn't look manly enough asks for he, him pronouns. Sometimes the exact same person who tells an NB, "I can't call you they, it's not grammatically correct," will suddenly be 100% fine using they/them pronouns to avoid calling a trans woman she or a trans man he. Because it was never about grammar, it was always about transphobia. It was always about sending a message to trans and non-binary people that I know your pronouns better than you do. As you might guess, this issue disproportionately affects trans women who don't look feminine enough, trans men who don't look masculine enough, and non-binary people who don't look androgynous enough to deserve their correct pronouns. It also affects trans and non-binary people who don't use the pronouns others might expect for their gender, like me as a non-binary person who uses he/him rather than they/them. And it can even affect cisgender men and women who don't conform to gender-based expectations, subjecting them to transphobia when they aren't even trans. Number 4. Misgendering via degendering with they/them pronouns. Some people think that they/them pronouns can't be used to misgender anyone because they're gender neutral. But if you know that someone uses certain pronouns and you call that person by different pronouns, that is the definition of misgendering. It doesn't matter if the incorrect pronouns you use are gender-neutral ones. If someone has let you know, I use he, or I use she, or I use anything else, and you call that person they, then you are still misgendering and therefore disrespecting that person. This practice is known as misgendering via degendering, using gender-neutral language to deny someone's gender rather than affirm it. In the previous point, when I talked about how someone will call a trans woman who doesn't look feminine enough they instead of she, or a trans man who doesn't look masculine enough they instead of he, that's a classic example of misgendering via degendering. Many people try to excuse this by saying something like, well, at least I didn't call you he, when they've called a woman they instead of she, for example. And when I hear an excuse like that, to me that says you do know it's possible to misgender someone by using they/them pronouns. You just thought you could get away with it because it seemed like a more politically correct form of misgendering. Number 5. Using they/them pronouns for everyone. Many people in the trans and non-binary community have been pushing for an end to the practice of assuming gender based on appearance. Because just like gender doesn't equal pronouns, gender also doesn't equal gender expression or the physical features of someone's body. So to avoid accidentally misgendering people, the safest approach is to use gender-neutral language for everyone until you know what language individual people find affirming. But what I'm seeing more and more often instead is people using they/them pronouns for everyone regardless. Men, women, non-binary people, trans people, or cis people, doesn't matter. The most common reasons I hear for this are, I'm really bad at remembering pronouns, so I just call everybody they to make sure I don't screw up. Or calling everybody they, including cis people, helps promote trans acceptance. And as much as I understand that that's coming from a place of good intent, it doesn't really hold up in practice. Because just like we saw in the previous point, misgendering via degendering is a very real issue that affects a lot of very real people, most of whom fall somewhere under the umbrella of trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming. And misgendering via degendering is exactly what you end up doing when you call everyone they, even after being informed of people's actual pronouns. In your attempt not to misgender anyone, you actually end up misgendering everyone except for those who use they/them pronouns. I think the only way using they for everyone would work is if we didn't have gendered third-person pronouns to begin with. Like if we didn't have he or she and they was the only option. But for better or for worse, we do have both gendered and gender-neutral third-person pronouns in English, and those gender connotations are very important to a lot of people. That may change over time. Maybe we evolve away the need for gendered pronouns in the future. But for right now, people who use gendered pronouns deserve to have them respected. So now that we've seen 5 ways people misuse they/them pronouns, how do we do better? How do we make sure we're using they/them pronouns responsibly? Singular they, them pronouns are appropriate to use in the following circumstances. Number 1. When you're talking about an unknown or hypothetical person. That was the original use case for singular they, and it's still the most common. Someone left their umbrella here, someone lost their wallet, etc. Number 2. When you're talking about someone whose identity needs to stay anonymous. Like I mentioned previously, this is typically done when you're trying to keep the person you're talking about safe. But I want to mention here that it can also be done to keep yourself safe, like if using your partner's actual pronouns would out you as queer, for example. It can even be done to help you avoid scrutiny. From a very young age, I learned that anytime I talked about one of my male friends, the second I said the word he, people's reactions were like, ooh, insinuating that there was something romantic going on. And that got really old long before I even realized I was on the aromantic spectrum. So I learned to be as generic as possible, no names, they, them pronouns only, when talking about my male friends. In general, it's most respectful to use people's actual pronouns, but when you need to leave out identifying information for whatever reason, then they, them pronouns are perfectly acceptable. Number 3. When you're talking about someone who uses they, them as personal pronouns. If someone introduces themselves with they, them pronouns, wears they, them pronoun pins or accessories, has they, them pronouns in their bio or email signature, then it's important to respect those pronouns and refer to that person as they. Number 4. When you're talking about someone whose pronouns you don't yet know. I saved this one for last because I want to make it really clear how we can avoid misgendering people as much as possible without crossing the line into misgendering via degendering. And what it boils down to is this. Use gender-neutral language for people until you learn what language they find affirming, and then switch to that. Now that sounds pretty simple on its face, but there are a few other things I want to note. The first is that you can't know for sure what gender someone is or what pronouns they use simply by their appearance. A lot of people tend to use gender-neutral language for anyone who looks androgynous or whose gender appears ambiguous or unclear, and then use gendered language for anyone else whose gender is obvious. But that does nothing to dismantle the assumption that gender and appearance are inextricably linked. Instead, it just others a lot of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people, often in situations where singling them out like that could be dangerous. And it still results in misgendering, because there are people who don't look like their actual gender, but also don't look androgynous, including a lot of people who are pre-transition or in the very early stages. So really, the best approach is to let go of the idea that anyone's gender is obvious from the way they look. Second is that addressing strangers in a gender-neutral way often doesn't even involve they, them pronouns, because typically you'll be addressing people directly with you, your pronouns instead, and those are already gender-neutral across the board. Gender-neutral language for strangers tends to look more like leaving out gendered titles and honorifics, things like ma'am and sir, Mr. and Miss, young man and young lady, etc. Being called they might feel weird to a person who doesn't use they, them pronouns, but not being called ma'am or sir probably isn't even going to register for most people because that's just extra, you know? The average cis person won't even notice if you say have a good day versus have a good day, sir, but the average trans person will, and they'll be relieved that you didn't misgender them. In the rare event that you do need to refer to a stranger in the third person, there are often more natural ways to go about it than using they, them pronouns. For example, this customer needs some extra help, or I was just showing this new student around campus. If you absolutely have to use pronouns, they, them are the safest bet for strangers, but the odds of that happening are a lot more slim than most people realize. Third is a tip for switching from gender-neutral language to gender-affirming language, and that's to look for pronoun indicators. The reason I'm pointing this out is because I don't go anywhere in public without some sort of he/him pronoun accessory on my person, yet hardly anyone ever notices or reads it. I have my pronouns in my social media bios, yet hardly anyone ever thinks to check them. And I know this because of how frequently I get misgendered. Not everyone uses pronoun indicators, but for those of us who do, we would really appreciate it if anyone paid attention. That not only gives you an easy way to know what to call us, but also can remind you in case you forget. So please double check before you assume, or before you just give up and call everybody they. And the fourth point is to realize that you don't need to know the pronouns of every new person you meet. Making that switch from gender neutral to gender affirming language is really just for people you're going to have a prolonged interaction or an ongoing relationship with. Some people try to show support for the trans community by asking others for their pronouns to make sure they're getting it right. And that's great if you're talking to a new friend or coworker or classmate, someone you'll be seeing again. What's even better is if you offer your own pronouns instead of asking directly, because being asked can put a lot of pressure on a trans person who may not be ready to answer. But if you're just speaking briefly to someone, like a customer in line or a stranger in passing, there is zero reason to bring up gender or pronouns at all. Instead, it's just easier to leave gender out of the interaction entirely. So that wraps up my advice for using they/them pronouns responsibly, and to recap, here's a handy list of what's cool and not cool. And I'm gonna leave that up on the screen for a bit to give you a chance to read it or take a screenshot as I turn the conversation over to you. Have you noticed people using they/them pronouns in less than optimal ways? Do you have any tips for using they/them pronouns responsibly that I didn't include in this video? If you speak a language other than English, do you encounter any similar issues and how that language is adapting to acknowledge and include non-binary people? And as always, what questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. If you want to reach out to me on other social media, I am GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person. I have cosplay music videos, makeup tutorials, a bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of your support. I hope you learned something new, and I will see you on the next one.